And now on to our program. Violence in our community is an issue that impacts all of us, directly and indirectly. In 2017, the Mayor's Office of Violence Prevention led a year-long process to create a community-developed and owned solutions called the Blueprint for Peace. I had the honor of serving on the steering committee, along with GMC members Dan Bader, Ellen Gilligan, Peggy Troy, and Mary Lou Young, along with a wide range of community stakeholders. As David mentioned, there were over 1,500 individuals that were involved in the process. Personally, I would say it was very instructive, it was political, it was fascinating, and it was challenging, and sometimes it was uncomfortable. It was a process that used an evidence-based approach, but it also made us look at some of our significant underlying issues in the community, and I learned a great deal. We learned that there are solutions that work, and you're going to hear about several today, but I will warn you there is no magical silver bullet. Most of these solutions require a long-term investment, and they require the commitment of the entire community to make the difference. I'd like to recognize those who funded the planning process, including a grant from the Medical College of Wisconsin's Advancing a Healthier Wisconsin Endowment, with partial funding from the Tides Foundation and Recast Milwaukee. We'd also like to thank Bader Philanthropies for a gift of $100,000 announced immediately following the release of the blueprint. Google invested in this effort, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Baird Foundation, the Pre-Family Foundation, a non-charitable trust, and the Crohn's Foundation. I'd like to thank all of those folks for their generous gifts. The City of Milwaukee is also heavily invested in the effort, including a $280,000 amount in the 2018 budget to support the ceasefire initiative. And I'd like to thank a small group that early on after Sherman Park came forward to support the efforts of the Blueprint and the ceasefire initiative. Our thanks to Ellen Gilligan, Amy and Fred Crone, and Les Weil for their diligent and committed efforts towards raising funds for this Blueprint and ceasefire initiative. There's much, much more to do to create change. It'll take all of us in this room to create a safe Milwaukee. Gifts to support the Blueprint can be made through the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. So afterwards, if you're inspired to do so, there's a fund that's been created within the foundation. And today we're going to hear from Mayor Tom Barrett and Reggie Moore, Director of the City of Milwaukee Health Department's Office of Violence Prevention. The Mayor and Reggie will review the plan and how you can get involved in this community-wide effort. We'll also hear from David Muhammad, the City of Milwaukee's Health Department's Violence Prevention Manager on ceasefire, one integral part of the Blueprint. And afterwards, Kira LaFawn, Market President and Publisher of the Milwaukee Business Journal, will moderate a panel, which includes Ashante Hamilton, our Common Council President, City of Milwaukee, Dan Bader, President of Bader Philanthropies, Reggie Moore, the Director of Office of Violence Prevention, and Mary Lou Young, the President and CEO of United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha. Kira and panelists, please feel free to come up to the stage once David's done. Now it's my honor to introduce the Mayor of the City of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, and Reggie Moore and David Muhammad.
Good afternoon. Happy New Year to everyone here. There was an article in the New York Times on December 27th that talked about the remarkable decrease in violence in the city of New York. Some of you may have seen the article, but I just want to run over the numbers with you to let you know why I believe this is an issue that not only can we be successful on, but we must be successful on. But as of December 27th of 2017, in New York City, there were 286 homicides. To put that in a context, in 1990, in New York City, there were 2,245 homicides. So over that 27-year span, you saw homicides drop from 2,245 to 286. I don't know what the final number was for the year, but I'm certain it was under 300. And that tells you that a community can deal with this issue. Equally amazing is the number of non-fatal shootings that occurred in New York City In 1990, it was well over 5,000. And as of December 27th, it was 774. Bear in mind that New York City has a population of 8.5 million, so it's roughly 14 times larger than the city of Milwaukee. Last year, we saw a 15% decrease in the number of homicides that we had in 2017. Our final number was 119. 119 for 600,000 people. Again, if you can do the math there, you can see that the homicide rate and the violence rate in New York City is dramatically lower than it is here in the city of Milwaukee. The same was true in Los Angeles. And in fact, if you look at the homicides in those two cities, they are fewer, when you combine those two cities, they are fewer than the number of homicides in Chicago. And unfortunately, the demographics that we have, and more specifically the activity, the violent activity we have here in Milwaukee, is more analogous to what you see in Chicago than you see in New York City. So how do we change that? What do we do? Many of you have heard me talk about my commitment, the city's commitment to the police department. And I'll say it again. The budget for the Milwaukee Police Department is larger than the entire tax levy for the city of Milwaukee. The budget levy, the property tax levy for this city is larger than the entire tax levy. So for anybody who's critical of the city, the fact that we are spending all of our property tax dollars for public safety demonstrates that this is our #1 priority. Now, we have made progress, and I'm very, very proud of the progress we have made. If you go back to 1990, in the early 1990s here in Milwaukee, our homicides were probably more in the neighborhood. I think we spiked somewhere around 180, somewhere in that neighborhood. I might be off on those numbers. When I started, we were probably about 122. We went down. In fact, we were well over 100 for several years in a row. But in 2015, we saw a spike that took us back to 147. That was a dramatic spike. Last year, now 2 years ago, so it went from 147 in 2015, 141 in 2016, 119 in 2017. So you see this, we are seeing progress over the last 2 years, which corresponds to the period in which we have been investing in our Office of Violence Prevention, which is what I want to talk about now. So why the Office of Violence Prevention? Again, you can see that we saw activity here that was alarming in 2015 that we knew we had to act on. And we knew we were putting millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into the police department. And quite candidly, we cannot hire a gazillion police officers. The resources aren't there. As a society, we can't have that happen. It's just not going to happen. So you have to find other ways to look at this issue. And we decided that it was time for us to take a much more concerted public health approach to this issue as well. And to look at the other factors that are contributing to the violence in the city. And a lot of them, not surprisingly, have to do with the environment in which people live, the access to guns, the lack of economic opportunity, and the challenges that families and individuals face, whether it's in the education system, whether it's in employment, whether it's in housing. But we felt it was important for us to interrupt the activity, the negative activity that leads to some of this violence. In other words, to go upstream and try to find out how we can interrupt this so that you don't have constant, what I would call neighborhood feuds that turn into deadly shootouts. So this is easier said than done, because you have to find people who are willing to go into the community or be part of the community. So not necessarily outsiders coming in, people from the community who understand the community and understand the need to interrupt what's going on prior to it becoming deadly. That's what led us to revamp our Office of Violence Prevention. And when we asked Reggie Moore to come and lead this effort, we were very, very pleased that he agreed to do it. So he and David and their team are the ones that are leading this effort. Again, the notion is if we can have individuals, not law enforcement, and this is not to take away anything from law enforcement, because we're going to continue to put a lot of emphasis on law enforcement, but if we can also have complementing that, supplementing that, individuals who are going to be willing to be part of the community. And this is a big part of this, is being part of the community itself. This is not something that can be brought in from the outside, I believe. It has to emanate from the community, and have more people involved, you're going to be more successful. That's what led us to go and create the Blueprint for Peace, to make sure that this is not a mayoral document, and I don't wash my hands of it, but this did not come out of my office. This was intended to be a community-driven effort so that you would have community buy-in as to the steps that we need to take to reduce the violence in the city. So we had well over 1,000, I think 1,500 people that were involved in this, and Reggie and David can talk about some of the steps that were taken to make sure that we had buy-in. Because what we're looking for is we're looking for this community, this city, the residents of this city, to own this issue as much as the mayor's office, as much as the Office of Violence Prevention, as much as others who are stepping forward. I am very, very thankful to the leadership that Julia has shown in getting the business community involved in this. This is something you don't see in every community. I want to thank Mary Lou for the work that she's done, getting the United Way involved in this. Dan Bader obviously stepped forward, as he always does, to help us with this effort. But it's an effort that we want to have be a community-wide effort, and to bring the urgency of the faith community, of the community in groups, of the neighborhood groups, certainly law enforcement, city government, county government, so that we can make the dramatic turnaround that they made in New York. I honestly believe we can do it. And the only way we're going to do it if we start working together. So again, I want to bring Reggie up to talk a little bit about what he has been doing, and then David will walk through some of this as well, and then we'll hear from our panel members. So again, this is an all hands on deck approach, and we'd love to have you on the ship. Thank you very, very much.
All right, good afternoon. And thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Taylor, for hosting this event and all of the GMC membership. It's been less than 2 years since I've been in this role, and I think the hardest part of this job as a husband and as a father is the fact that we've had at least 4 children who've been killed within that period of time. And the mayor and I and the health commissioner and others have attended the funerals of children in this city. And although we may, debate and have disagreement around how to measure the impact of violence prevention, I think the core thing that we can all agree on is that no child in this city, their life should not be taken, and no parent should have to bury their child due to gun violence or suicide. And so as I walk through this process and the contents and the goals and the strategies of the blueprint, I want us to keep that in mind as a city. When we get into conversations about policy and we get into conversations about funding, sometimes we lose sight of the people that we are trying to serve and the impact that we are trying to have. So I just want to center us in that as we go through this presentation. So I'll cover basically the goals and strategies, the implementation priorities, the leadership and oversight that will be required to execute the blueprint, and the evaluation and metrics that were discussed among the steering committee and the community. I'm actually going to go a little bit quick, and I'll basically skip through things that have been covered already. You also have 2 copies of the blueprint on each table, so if you want to kind of flip through that. For those of you who don't have a blueprint on your phone, you can pull up 414life.com to also go through the detail of the blueprint. But this basically covers the steering committee. So I'll talk about the values of the blueprint. There were 4 central values that were identified by the community, and this process actually started with 125 community members at Discovery World, and we had everybody from young people, right from the neighborhood, to law enforcement, the DA's office, business leaders, philanthropy, everyone in the room really grappling with, what does this blueprint need to look like? What does it need to do? And how should it be structured? And so this was one of the initial conversations that we had, and these were the 4 that resonated: community, equity, resilience, and action. Really briefly, that this process needed to be driven and centered by the community. Equity, understanding that violence does not it affects everyone, but the impact of homicides in particular impacts different populations and neighborhoods differently, and recognizing the inequity of violence, not only in Milwaukee, but throughout the country. That it needs to be built on resilience, and the fact that we hear a lot of data, we hear a lot of negative statistics, but there's also a lot of power and leadership among the grassroots, among nonprofits, among philanthropy, elected officials in this city, and really looking at how do we highlight the strengths in these neighborhoods. And then lastly, action. That although it's a gorgeous document, it is not something that we just want you to look at, but it's something that has to be actionable and that we have to take action on. The vision of the blueprint is that Milwaukee is a safe and resilient city where the lives of all residents are valued, promoted, and protected. And each of those words are extremely intentional in terms of this vision. There were a menu of risk factors that, and we worked quite intensely with the Prevention Institute, which is based out of Oakland. So if you're interested in getting more information or background in violence prevention in general, we highly encourage you to check out the Prevention Institute's website. But they basically, we brought them in as consultants to support this process and bring a lot of research and data from around the country. And so the community was able to look at the risk factors that have been identified nationally around driving violence. And the ones that you're going to see and that you see in the blueprint are the ones that were prioritized in Milwaukee. And so a couple of them, and again, some of these may not be new to you, but in terms of segregation from opportunity, lack of access to resources, limited employment and economic opportunities, quality housing, limited government community trust. And this is something that the young people and adults in the room and throughout the process came up pretty repeatedly. And I think we've had a breakdown in terms of that trust for many different reasons. And so restoring that trust is critical. Others that came up was looking at adverse childhood experiences and persistent trauma. We talk about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic trauma, particularly when we talk about soldiers and in neighborhoods, but we also have to understand that a lot of trauma is actually persistent. Looking at harmful norms about masculinity and femininity. We had a very intense conversation about that, and I think in this country, and if you watched the Golden Globes last night, I think it was reiterated that we really have to do some deep soul searching in terms of the norms that we are raising our children in our community, in terms of how we treat and interact with each other. Looking at high alcohol outlet density, which has a lot of implication in terms of policies. Whether it be the Common Council, the county board, the state, but really looking at how our policies can either create harm or create protective factors against violence. And as the mayor also mentioned, the availability of illegal guns is something that is also persistent, that the community validated as a driving force of violence. So on the flip side, we also talked about resilience and protective factors. So local investment, youth engagement, positive activity, civic engagement, strong schools, improving the physical and built environment. Access to community resources, ensuring that every young person has access to a quality, caring, and consistent adult. Looking at the intersection of arts, culture, and faith. So looking at, when we talk about resilience, and those of us in this room who've been through extremely hard times and may have had lack of access to certain supports and resources, oftentimes our faith and our beliefs, was something that sustained us. And being connected to cultural and arts organizations are also key factors that the community also identified. In your document, and also in the summary document as well, this was a framework that the Prevention Institute provided that really looked at how do we understand the intersections between equitable opportunity, place, and people. And understanding that violence is a social justice issue as well as any other issue that we talk about. And understanding that having access, these things are not by accident. When we look at where we invest money, where do we build our companies, where do we hire from, where do we provide transportation access to, all of those things are intentional and have either intended or unintended consequences that we have to really look systemically at. In my background as a community organizer and a youth development worker, and just a lot of my work has been in the nonprofit sector, it's almost like you have a nonprofit for every single issue. So if you take the human body, there's a nonprofit for the hand, there's a nonprofit for the leg, and for every other issue. And unfortunately, we do not do a good job of coordinating and working together to understand why is the body sick in the first place? Is it the environment that's contributing to the illness or something else structurally that we need to address? So these were the goals of the blueprint. There were 6 goals and 30 strategies identified. And again, I won't read through each one of them because I'll cover them a little bit more intently in a moment. But these are the 6 goals. The criteria for those goals and for the strategies within the blueprint really focused on evidence-based. So even if something that was innovative and may not have been academically evaluated, it has shown promise in other communities. Community will is really important in terms of the strategies that are identified. And we're prevention focused. We've had questions when people read the blueprint. People may not feel like there's not enough emphasis on either courts or cops in the blueprint. And although they are captured in terms of strategies in terms of trauma-informed courts and really ensuring that law enforcement has the proper training that's needed to be able to engage in procedural justice as they do their job, we recognize the fact that this is really about looking upstream and really prevention focused. So goal number one, stop the violence. And you'll hear a little bit more about this in detail, at least one of the strategies that we're exploring through Ceasefire Milwaukee. But the first one really talks about the fact that we need access to timely and comprehensive data. Some of you may be familiar with the Homicide Review Commission, which has been led by Mallory O'Brien, and other efforts at the Medical College to really look at how do we understand and analyze the data of where shootings are happening, who's impacted by it, and what are some of the driving factors. As we've seen repeatedly over the past, I would say 5 to 10 years, consistently arguments and fights, drug-related homicides, as well as domestic violence-related homicides are some of the driving factors that impact shootings and homicides in our city. And really looking at reducing the incidence of violence through proactive prevention efforts, of which ceasefire is one. But it requires actually having access to consistent data to do that. Number two, healing and restorative justice. Again, I won't read through all of them, but just to give you an idea of some of the strategies that are contained within. The city already has a partnership with the police department, as well as community-based organizations in Milwaukee County called the Trauma Response Initiative, that when a child witnesses violence, we ensure that that family has access to counseling within 72 hours. And so these are the types of things, and through our Recast Milwaukee initiative, which is a $5 million, 5-year initiative, really looking at how do we reduce the impact of trauma and address the sources of trauma in our community, particularly trauma that is produced by not only interpersonal violence, but also systemic violence. The other one is looking at strengthening treatment and healing services. So we understand, one, the impact of domestic violence and sexual assault, but also understanding the impact that the opioid crisis and drug abuse and addiction is also having in our children among our children and families. Goal number three, as you will see in the blueprint, we would say is the largest bucket of the blueprint. There are a lot of issues intertwined in this particular goal, everything from child abuse and neglect, looking at domestic violence, looking at early childhood, ensuring that young people have access